The year is 2015, and artist and video game developer Mason Lindrith was set to release his most ambitious game yet, after years of working on much smaller scale games for a variety of Ludum Dare projects. This was covered in part 1, but a quick summary is that Mason Lindrith is a claymation artist who excels at making unnerving or surreal designs using a mix of clay sculptures and digital art. Up until now, most of his games were either art galleries or extremely bare bones experiences. So, enter Hylics, and now Mason has single-handedly put out an entire RPG, recreational program, as he puts it, for the world to enjoy. And what a trip this is, both in the literal and figurative sense. The first thing almost everyone will immediately notice is the art. It's just packed with detail, vibrant if off-putting pastel colors, and everything is made out of some variation of mangled or layered tubes of clay. Another thing that might strike some people is a resemblance to Earthbound in its combat presentation and weirdness factor, as all the combat is accompanied by distorted and abstract animated backgrounds that's all presented as if it's in first person. Of course, visually is kinda where the similarities end, really. And the visuals are primarily what got me to try this. I'm not really a big RPG guy, but the art and animations were so weird and enticing that I just had to try it. It really helped that it was only $3. So it's kind of a shame that more people don't really know about it, like anyone I personally know. Hey Raj, do you know what Hylics is?
No.
Hylics, these nuts.
Fucking hell, dude. Yeah.
I might as well get this out of the way now, since I'll largely be talking about the game itself. The art is excellent. It's a little slapdash and jank in some places, but I feel that actually adds to the overall charm, because the game already comes off as pretty weird. The walking animations for some of the characters are all over the place, and it doesn't even look like they're walking the same way in every angle. As off as it looks, I do love the weird arm flailing walk that Wayne has. And when I said it was a little slapdash, I mostly meant in respects to how most enemies and characters will appear. You'll notice a similar theme among many of them, where you just see Mason reuse this action figure he had lying around in order to work on posing while focusing their designs primarily on the head. Sometimes more of the body will be covered in clay, but for most enemies, it's just the head. I fully understand why it was done, and I don't even hate it really. It makes everything seem a little familiar while also being completely off the rails, where various parts of their bodies are just changed with mangled shapes of clay. Also, in some cases, backgrounds or skill effects can be digitized images or videos, which again kinda works in this game's favor of being a world that just makes no goddamn sense. One moment you're fighting behind a psychedelic moving pattern as a backdrop, the next it's just a picture of a restaurant's empty parking lot in the middle of a desert. Which brings me to the name. Hylics, or just Hylic, is a Greek word that means matter, which I'd say is fairly appropriate because matter is really the only tangible constant that exists in this game. All of that comes together to make a fantastic art piece even if there was no real game to it. Thankfully, what game there is allows Hylics to be a vehicle for even more weird art. In fact, this game can even be found in the Telfair Museum in Savannah, Georgia, at least as of 2018 as far as I could see. So, now on to the game itself. First thing you'll notice is the resolution, in that it's abysmally tiny. This is what it looks like on my 1080p monitor for reference. So if you value your eyes, just hit Alt and Enter at the same time to force into full screen. The resolution will still be low, but at least you won't be straining your eyes like I had to in order to record this video. But on to the real first thing you see, and that's this really nice title screen. I gotta say, most games don't have menus this nice looking, let alone one from an RPG Maker game. Unfortunately, quality isn't something that's often expected out of games using this engine, so this is a pretty good start already. After that, you're taken to a prelude where you have little control other than walking around a small area. After a short period of time, it fades and the game tries to make some attempt at conveying a story. It'll make absolutely no sense at first, and don't worry, that's because it doesn't. This game does a fun little thing where almost all dialogue in this game is procedurally generated. There are some things that might stay the same, like structure, certain words, and how long it is, but other than that, the characters will indefinitely repeat random dialogue. There are some instances where NPCs will have completely set dialogue, and you can usually tell the difference when you talk to an NPC and you don't hear this bootleg Charlie Brown sound. You also get a little screen announcing each act that you have to hit some switches in order to move on. So far, this game makes a pretty good first impression as far as telling you, yeah, this is gonna be a weird game. So once you finally get control of your character, you're put in a small space that introduces you to almost all the mechanics you'll need to be familiar with for the overworld. There's plenty to interact with. You'll learn that TVs teach you your spells, also known as gestures. You'll learn what rest areas can look like. You'll find a warm burrito in the toilet, which will no doubt immediately prompt you to look at it to see what it does, and to find out that it's this game's revival item. You'll also find some toilet paper, which really does nothing but get you to look at the inventory screen, as it doesn't actually boost your stats at all. There's also a crystal that the game forces you to activate before you can leave, and these act as warp points for when you die. Once you're outside, there's just a few more stuff to interact with and learn what it does. I really like how there's a field of vegetable trees next to the house, and when you grab it, it'll tell you what you got, but only for the first one, just so it doesn't waste your time. Overall, these first two screens are really well thought out. My favorite little detail is this one NPC at the top of the map. If you talk to him, he'll tell you about a bunch of cities. Or at least I thought it was a bunch of cities. It's actually just the same city, and he'll constantly keep giving it a new name because his dialogue is procedurally generated, as I mentioned. When you actually get around to this town, whatever he said last will actually be his name. Another NPC does something similar in that town where he'll name the plateau that you eventually go up to. But the most important thing that you need to learn here is that you should really explore. There's a guaranteed $100 you can find between the suitcase in Wayne's house and a trash can off to the side across the water, and I'll get into why that's important, but it's probably the most impactful $100 you can find in this game, and consequently, exploring and finding other rare loot is pretty rewarding. So, when you leave and enter the world map, you'll see two areas you can go to. One draws more attention and is ideally where you should go. But it's worth noting that really 90% of this game is optional. There's actually no connecting story between the events that unfold, you simply just find the right path, and having more party members, gestures, and gear just makes it easier. I mostly say that as context because I might have fucked up a bit during my playthrough and went almost the entire game with only 2 party members. So this town is the first and only one in this game. Expect to come back here a few times to get more money since there is some really nice gear you can get, and it's also one of the only places you can heat up frozen burritos to turn them from the projectile items into a revival item. I love the idea of this town. It's a multi-level city built into the side of a plateau, which visually is pretty cool, but it can be a pain to navigate sometimes since you have to make some long detours to get to certain shops, and if you're somewhere high up and want to get down quickly, it's not like you can just jump down. And once you get to the plains, you're introduced to the combat, which is rough at first, to say the least. This area is made to be a giant asshole at the start. You almost always encounter 3 enemies, with one being a statue that will first turn blind you and reduce your hit rate to practically nothing, so it's just several minutes of enemies wailing on you. I like to imagine the intent was to teach players that status effects and using abilities are important, but I don't think it worked out too well. Especially if you don't know a specific quirk to the combat. And that is that turn order isn't really dictated by any kind of stat. Despite the inventory screen giving you all these numbers, like cooking and joyous, there's really only 3 stats in this game. Damage, also known as mightiness, health, known as flesh, and mana, known as will. Turn order is dictated purely based off what ability you use. In general, buffs, debuffs, and heals on your end go off first, and attacks can vary. Some are meant to always go off even before buffs, others are dictated to go off at the very end no matter what. So in general, you don't have to worry about a clutch heal not going off, because more often than not, your heal will go first, and there's virtually no dangerous attacks that go first. They also probably made it fairly hard, so you'll be familiar with the death system in this game. It's not just a simple game over screen. In this game, you get sent to a new area where you have a few things available at first. There's a grinder where you can sacrifice meat from killed enemies to increase your max HP. This is basically the closest thing to leveling this game has. Other than that, there's a few things you can explore. If you have dynamite, you can blow up this cave for a new gesture, and if you die 3 times, which you probably will in this area, you get access to this ledge, which has a really good weapon and a water cooler which you can't use yet. This is also how you use the crystals you found, since you can select which crystal to warp to. There's absolutely no dialogue unfortunately, so you have to try and remember the color of the crystal, which I can understand might be a pain for those with various forms of color blindness. So once you get back into the action with your new weapon in hand, you can try to fight these enemies off a bit better. For these enemies, it's highly advised to try and open combat with your starting power, Hypno Sigil, as it has a high chance to put enemies to sleep, and with your axe you can nearly one-shot the cone cultists and save the statue to fend for itself. Unfortunately, Hypno Sigil does not go first, but at least missing doesn't wake the enemy up. However, there was one thing we could have done to avoid all this headache. Remember that 100 bucks we found in Wayne's house? Assuming you didn't spend it, that's exactly enough to buy the bleak cellophane from this guy, which straight up prevents blind, making this whole area so much more manageable. I'm kind of in two minds about this, because while it's kind of easy to find since it's on the ground floor of the city, I don't like how it's so much harder to do without a simple item until you get your first party member. Which, granted, is in this area, but you wouldn't really know that if you didn't play this game beforehand. So, for my playthrough, I just got the axe and skipped the enemies until I could get my party member. There's just too many, and eventually you will die since walking to the town to heal up is just too time consuming. So once you meet up with this guy, he'll ask you to retrieve an artifact for him, with a hint being found in a dream realm you access with a device he has. This short span of time is where I learned this game was going to be an interesting ride. You see the hint in front of you, but you can exit this box to see you're in some kind of brain dimension, paired with a pretty slick track too. I said in part 1 that I'm not sure if Mason was able to get away with being an amateur composer since his games are so weird to begin with. But with some of the tracks in this game, I'm starting to believe he's a pretty solid composer. I'll just leave you to stew in this for a second. I don't know about you, but I feel pretty fucking enlightened right now. And after you return from the brain dimension, you can retrieve the artifact, which is just a paper cup. When you give it to him, he'll show you how to use the water coolers you saw earlier. They'll show this message. Your companion places the paper cup into a recess on the front of the machine and depresses a small blue lever. Fluid flows from the reservoir into the paper cup. And that is the most verbose and esoteric way to describe filling a cup with water. Which is where it hit me how much this game tries to avoid using sensical phrasing, even when it's not procedurally generated. It goes by quick, but even the gestures themselves all have weird descriptors about how the ability is being cast. You invoke mystic meat. You waft ancient odor. It's the little touches like that that really add to this game feeling like a weird surrealist hell, and I love it. After that's taken care of, you can go to the control center, which made me believe this game was breaking, since it kinda just ran like shit, and the music sounded horribly glitchy. But no, that's just how it works. There's a warp console in the center, which allows you to enter the recolored world. One of the first structures you see is pretty prominent, so chances are you'll end up going there first. But alternatively, if you keep heading left from here, you'll find another terminal. This will take you back to the overworld, and more specifically, to where you can find your third party member. Now, if anyone was paying attention to the footage near the end of part 1, this might look a little familiar. This party member's name is Somsnosa, and this house is the same exact location from Mason's delisted game of the same name. All you need to do to get her as a party member is get her magic gauntlets from the basement, which is full of ambulant skulls. These guys are the same skulls from Weird Egg and Crushing Finger and serve the same purpose. Touch them, you die. There is no fight. Once you get these gauntlets and Somsnosa becomes a part of your group, you might want to gear her out. Except, you kinda can't. She's special because she can't use any weapon on her own and is also unable to use some other gear that the rest of the gang can. However, she has a huge upside. You can interact with these little animals scattered across the world in order to increase the mightiness of her weapon. If you remember where all the bugs have been up to this point, because they can be in some rather obscure locations, you can turn her into an absolute powerhouse. So, with the third party member, this boss fight coming up will be a piece of cake. After that, you largely have free reign to explore the rest of the world since you can take the boat anywhere. This is where you can go straight to the fourth and final party member, Pongorma. On the central island, there's a pretty straightforward puzzle you have to solve, which gives you access to a fight with him, as well as a special gesture. This is the first multi-enemy gesture everyone can use that actually does damage. You'll be suffering if you don't get this. I'd argue this gesture is better than Pongorma himself. But Pongorma is still pretty good too, since he has one of the strongest weapons in the game, and he can destroy the ambulance skulls so they no longer kill you. They do respawn, however. In fact, if you happen to get access to the boat before getting Somsnosa, you can get Pongorma third and then use his power to make getting Somsnosa just that little bit easier. So now that you have all 4 party members, you might realize something depending on how you've played up until now. There's a pretty big difference between the stats and abilities of your first 2 party members compared to your last 2. The reason being, and this could be due to technical limitations for all I know, is that new party members don't scale to your current set of stats and abilities, presumably because no ability is really set and it all hinges on whether you explored and found them or not. So with each party member, you kinda have to go back to each and every one of the TV sets you found in order to teach them all the abilities over again. This also applies to boosting your max flesh and will. If you used all your meat and paper cups until now, the rest of your party is probably behind a decent chunk. Thankfully, this game is a very short runtime, so the problem really isn't too bad, but it definitely doesn't feel good knowing that you probably wasted some meat as well as paper cups. Really, the only part that I have an issue with is will. There's so few coolers in the game, and if you use too many before getting the rest of your squad, you end up losing a lot of power, since this is an optional objective which gives you a crazy strong spell that costs 200 will. Everyone starts out with 100 will, so if you use 2 out of the 6 coolers in this game, unless you get all 6, the last 2 party members are not going to be able to use that spell whatsoever, outside of using a few items that also reduce your power. And it very much is possible to get 3 of the 6 coolers before finding Somsnosa or Pongorma. Case in point, that actually happened to me during this run. Granted, that really expensive spell does kinda trivialize the game, but you still do lose overall uses of your gestures. I think even Mason knew that it would be a little bit annoying to have to go back to all the TV sets for your abilities, because there's a little detail that can be seen in Wayne's house. Every time you get a new party member, the cat in this house has another kitten, so when you return with all 4 party members, you have a trio of little kitties running around. At least that's what I figured. There's only really one other reason to return to this house in the first place, and that's to give these roaches some food for some unique items, but you only do that once. But moving on, the only thing left to do in this point is go to the graveyard. From here on out, the areas are going to get a bit more involved with some extra gimmicks. The gimmick of this place specifically is that you need to dig up various gravestones to uncover underground areas with switches. The first one you dig up will both have a map and a crystal, so it's all about memorizing the locations in this area. And this area is where you'll definitely feel any lack of gestures you might have, because the enemies here are kinda huge dicks. Not only do they have crazy high evade chance, but they also cast blind, so even if you do roll for a hit, it almost assuredly will miss, so you kinda have to rely entirely on gestures for them. So now that you have the door open, you can descend into the crypts. At least, that's what I assume is going on here. This place is very weird, and I dig how the only walkable terrain is just these massive corpses strung together. Like the previous zone, the enemies here can also kinda get fucked. If you don't cast Mystic Meat on turn 1, you're just asking to get reamed in the slowest way possible, because these big-headed enemies will cast a gesture which inflicts paralysis. Now, paralysis is a status effect which immobilizes you completely and does not wear off. If you fuck up, like I do here, and accidentally guard instead of cast Mystic Meat, you'll just have to watch the enemies slowly tear you to shreds, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it. Thankfully, these are some of the easiest enemies to avoid as they run in set patterns and leave huge gaps for you. The boss fight up ahead is what's going to ruin your day if you missed the last 2 party members. Again, kinda like I did. This is mostly because it means that you won't have any good multi-enemy skills. In this fight, smaller versions of the boss will spawn roughly every turn up to a limit. The total number is actually really high and can be quite hard to manage without a way to take out several enemies at once. But if you have Dark Flame, which you almost assuredly found next to Pangorma, then this fight is a piece of cake. Alternatively, and this is something I didn't do, you can actually kill every enemy in the control center because they drop dynamite, which is actually a pretty strong multi-enemy item, which normally is very expensive to purchase. But I completely forgot about that, so I ended up figuring out that I could just sneak right past the boss because he leaves the tiniest gap on his set path. Yeah, it's cheesy as hell, I know, but by this point I knew I fucked something up with my party and just wanted to get past this for now. In my defense, I did come back when I had Somsnosa and Pangorma to fight him legitimately without boosting my stats up from that point, and it admittedly went by very fast. But at least I redeemed myself, kinda. After that, you're in the final room of the crypt, and this one's a doozy. It's not particularly hard, it's just kinda janky. So the moment you walk past this statue, it'll come to life and chase you down like an eldritch Pac-Man. If they touch you, you die. Thankfully, there's a crystal right here, so you won't lose too much time getting back. The reason it's so jank is because the pathfinding on enemies isn't particularly great. If there's a barrier between you and the enemy, they'll generally try and run straight at you even if it means running into the barrier. So it's really hard to control these guys when baiting them alone is extremely difficult, and that's just when there's one of them. When there's two, and you're trying to bait one while the other one is heading right for you, you kinda don't have a choice but to just run or you'll die. So there's two exits here that you have to worry yourself about. One in the top right leads to an optional NPC, and the other one in the top left is the way out. The top right exit is also kind of a huge dick, because if you get near it, a statue will come out immediately, and if you don't know this, you will die. It just comes out too fast. But once you get over that, you get to talk to an NPC, which I haven't talked about at this point. There are 3 stages, one in the plateau, control center, and here. They each give you a token that you can take to an island, which unlocks the previously mentioned gesture that costs 200 will. The Legend of Melting! This thing is insane, as it does a whopping 3.5 times damage 3 times to random enemies. And if there's only one enemy, it will hit them with all 3 attacks. If you want to cheese this game to the end, use this. If you take the other exit, you'll end up by a tower that gives you the ability to summon an airship. With this, you could visit a couple places for some optional gags, but from here you can just beat the game. The only one of note I'll mention is this shack, where, upon entering, you'll be given a pair of shades and a guitar, which allows you to use a number of keys to play various guitar-like sounds. Interacting with your party members adds some extra layers to it. A really out-of-place addition if you've only played Hylics, but after going through Mason's Ludum Dare library, it's really not surprising this was added. Almost Fluid Plantain was an amusing idea, so I'm kinda down to see a similar gag. But there's also a really nice gesture here too. And there's also another area with this dude on a rocking chair who's guarding a lever. If you press this button, he'll give you a warning. If you keep pressing it, he'll give you an item. But if you continue to press it, he'll kinda lose his mind, give you a paper cup, and basically tell you to fuck off. You can keep pressing it, but nothing will happen. This is important for later, I promise. So, on to our final destination now. You'll head off at this giant tower that you scaled to reach the main office of this laboratory. You need to get permission to enter, but the foreman is asking for a password, which you'll never be able to guess. This is another great use of the randomly generated text, as all 3 sets of passwords will be different even if you have to retry the fight. With him out of the way, you find out the scientists were developing ways of turning matter into money. By messing with the machine, you'll end up with like 700,000 bucks. Way more than you could possibly spend in this game. The reason for that is in order to get to the final boss, you need to buy keys to a spaceship from this guy running a hot dog cart, and it costs 99,000. At this point, you might as well buy like 100 hot dogs because it's basically a free version of the total party heal gesture. And this is the start of the game doing pretty much everything in its power to make this last fight so much easier. Once you take this ship up to the fortress on the moon, you're greeted with a scary sight. Some really high level looking enemies and a huge amount of them. This actually had me worried. But the moment you interact with one of them, It plays a recurring gag where sometimes when you interact with certain chests and trash cans, they'll just crumple and it'll say something like, "You accidentally crushed it." So when you interact with one of these NPCs, the enemy just crumples over and it says, "You accidentally crushed it." And from that point on, every enemy is trying to run away in a frenzy as you just one-shot them by walking into them. There's not even a boss fight. It's kind of a cathartic moment to show how powerful you've become, even if it kind of does go from 0 to 100, especially since I died once to the foreman. But one thing I should note here, it doesn't tell you, but every single enemy you kill here does drop meat. Yeah, that's right, you'll get over 100 meat worth of enemies here, so if you end up dying to the final boss, you can pretty much just double your base HP and try again. On top of that, you have the Legend of Melting most likely, because it's not that hard to get, so you can absolutely just roll this final boss. The gimmick is supposed to be he has 2 towers, where one heals and guards for him and the other one puts status effects, but really you only have to worry about the healing tower since Mystic Meat is hilariously powerful. If you really want to dunk on this guy, you can get both towers down, and since he's the only target left, just use Legend of Melting, which does probably a quarter of his HP at this point. So once he's dead, the game has one final gag to give you. You'll actually earn XP for this fight and reach level 63, as if suddenly this game turned into a normal RPG. The best part is, this isn't even a visual gag either. The game will take you from, at most, like 600 HP to over 5,000, and you and your party members will be hitting the damage cap of 999, since you can still play up to this point. There's just no new gameplay from when you beat the final boss. So after you and him have a moment, I guess, he just sets the moon to self-destruct, so now you just gotta get out of there. And once you do escape, the next thing you see is Wayne and your gang having crash landed in the middle of the field and taken out the guy who was guarding that lever. So, you finally get to see what he's been guarding this whole time. And it turns out he was guarding you from the ending itself. I love this ending screen so much. There's a level of build up to it that is also completely optional. I've never seen it handled like this before, and it's just an excellent way to end this weird fucking game. So, that's Hylics. It's not really long, or hard, but it didn't even need to be. Heck, it didn't even need to be a game. Frankly, if this was just an art gallery, I would have loved it either way. But the fact that it was an RPG really helped it be more than just art, and even give us more excuses for more art in really cool ways. You'll definitely have some trouble starting it, no doubt, since saying this game is a little rough around the edges is kind of an understatement, but once the ball gets rolling, it's not so bad. So with all this room for improvement to be done on pretty much every front, next we'll take a look at the sequel to this game that wouldn't be set to come out for another 5 years after the initial release of Hylics. This time, he's bringing in some help as well. Would you believe me if I said half the reason I want to make this video was just so I can make someone fall for this?
We waited 3 months for a these nuts joke.
Yeah? Gotta follow that, mister. Well, like I said, I fucking premeditated this shit.